Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world right now. Welcome to the Friday Happy Hour Live webcast from WhiskyCast.com. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast studio in Haddonfield, New Jersey. A gorgeous day today, but decided not to take the gear outside. If you've been listening to the podcast the last couple of weeks, we're now offering the audio from these webcasts each week as a special episode of the podcast midweek with just the audio. But if you heard some of our early episodes outside, you know that we are sort of on the approach path to the Philadelphia International Airport. And this is the time of day when we get a plane overhead about every 3 or 4 minutes, buzzing pretty much right over the house. So inside today with the fan going, staying comfortable and cool, and in honor of the start of the Tokyo Olympics a year late, and hoping this thing doesn't get way out of hand with COVID, today's whiskey is a Nikka whiskey, 21-year-old Taketsuru Pure Malt from the Taketsuru Distillery at Nikka Whiskey in Japan. So, Sláinte, best of luck to all of the Olympians out there. We're going to have some fun over the next hour or so. A couple of distillers that I have a lot of respect for are joining us today. And I want to bring in Bob Baxter and Todd Leopold. Bob is with Yukon Spirits, way up in Whitehorse, Yukon, in northern Canada. And he and his colleague Alan Hansen have been making some of the best Canadian single malts out there for the last few years or so. We're going to get his story along with Todd Leopold from Leopold Brothers in Denver. And you may have seen Dave Broom's comments about the Leopold Brothers rye that came out of Todd's unique science fiction, like almost 3-chamber still. Dave came out with this a couple of days ago, and I'm going to get Todd to explain this still to you. But first of all, guys, thank you for both joining us right now. And Bob, give us a sense of what things are like right now up in Whitehorse.
Thanks for having us, Mark. A real treat to be here today. It's summer in the Yukon, which means that it's light outside about 22 hours a day, but changing quickly as we head into the fall. So beautiful day. Somehow we've avoided all the smoke from the forest fires that are dominating Western Canada. Usually we're in the midst of them, but right now it's a beautiful, clear day outside. So great to be here.
And we should point out that Whitehorse is the last major city/town of any note as you're heading towards the Alaska border on the Alaska Highway. I can say that from experience because I have been through Whitehorse twice. In my years up in Alaska, we drove up there and I drove out by myself and went out in and out through Whitehorse both times. Beautiful country up there in the middle of the forests north of British Columbia up in the Yukon. Great place to make whiskey, although I'm not sure you can grow a lot of barley up there, can you, in the middle of, with the winters as cold as they get, right?
It's odd. We don't grow any barley or very limited amounts of barley, more experimental than anything in the Yukon, although there is a lot of barley that's grown in Alaska. What there is not is a maltster up here. So if you want to use malted barley, you have to buy it. It has to go down south to be malted unless you're to malt it yourself. So all of our barley is, I shouldn't say all. Most of it comes from Western Canada. We do make peated whiskeys, and that barley comes from Aberdeen, Scotland. So from here and there.
Now, Todd, tell us what's going on in Denver these days.
Well, in Colorado, I think we're a part of the source of those fires. That I'm glad you're not getting too much haze from that. But very warm summer. We had a nice long spring for a change, so that's affecting our fruit harvest in particular is a couple weeks late. As distillers, I think we're a little bit more attuned to what's happening in terms of water and what's happening in terms of temperature than other folks are. But we're slowly sliding into fall, which I am very much looking forward to. As you can tell, I'm not much into summers. I'm not a beach guy, so excuse me. So I'm already ready for fall, ready for the start of hockey. I was hoping Montreal was gonna make it happen this year. So sorry about that. I don't, Tampa Bay, just a tough team this year, but yeah, that's kind of what's on my mind these days, trying to relax and not think too much about whiskey.
And we should point out that the Kraken did not take your captain, Gabriel
Yeah.
Landeskog, away in the expansion draft when they could have, which is another good thing for you.
That's right. They didn't take Price as well. So some interesting choices that they made. And I can't imagine being that GM after all the success that Las Vegas had. I think the pressure is really on to perform, and we'll see. We'll see how they wind up doing. But it's been nice that Colorado's been playing so well of late. Makes it an awful lot of fun. But I'm a longtime hockey and lacrosse fan, so yeah.
Well, you grew up in Michigan too, didn't you? You and your brother started out in Ann Arbor at first, right?
Well, the business did. Scott and I grew up here in Columbine, and unfortunately, everybody knows the high school. We both went to Columbine High School. We left Colorado because we determined that the market was saturated for breweries, and everybody kind of laughs at that now. But we weren't wrong. And we opened up just outside the a couple blocks away from the big house where the University of Michigan is. And there weren't any breweries at the time when we put our business plan together. And we thought, 100,000 plus American football fans, it isn't the worst environment to sell beer, and we weren't wrong. So
now I have to ask, you talked about water issues. You guys depend up there in the Rockies a lot on snowpack, right? How is the water system holding up there?
If you're asking me, I'm not sure how far we're defining the Rockies, I guess, but it's a mess. We're not doing well. The water table is along the Colorado. The rivers are at lows. The reservoirs are low. It's been a long time issue for a good 30 plus years. And, part of what we do here, for those who don't know, my brother went to Stanford and got his master's in environmental engineering. So we do an awful lot to reduce our water usage as much as possible. And that just gets more and more important in the West with every passing year. So a typical distillery, brewery, winery have anywhere, for every bottle produced, anywhere between 4 and as high as 30 or 40 bottles of wastewater that goes out. And we're a little bit under 3 here. So obviously the things that you do, your choices that you make in manufacturing can add up really quickly. And if you don't mind a quick anecdote, one way that we handle it is wooden fermenters. Wooden fermenters can't be clean. So the typical protocol when you're fermenting beer, wine, spirits, whatever it is, and you move the liquid into a tank for packaging or to distill, your cleaning regime is the same. Hot water rinse, caustic soda of some kind that's going to get out the proteinaceous materials. Another hot water rinse, hot acid that gets out any mineral substances that may adhere to the tank. Rinse again, hit it with sanitizer. And so you can imagine as you're turning these tanks over, especially if you're talking about distillation, where people turn their tanks as fast as every 3 days, and you're going through that much chemical and water every single time, that's where you wind up with that 40-to-1 water, the wastewater to water ratio. For us, for the fermenters, wooden fermenters, we drain them out. We hit them with one last little bit of water. That water gets pushed, cleans the hose out, and pushes it into the still, and now it's ready to fill again. So this is a much more efficient way of handling things, not just in terms of water usage, because nothing's going to drain, but also in terms of finances, because we don't have to pay for all the chemical, all the rinse, the water going in you pay for, the water going out you pay for as effluent, and then all the labor costs. So our wooden fermenters, if you compare them with the stainless steel fermenter, they're actually free after 8.5 years. So we've got a bunch of fermenters that are in the back that are all paid for versus what we would be doing if they were stainless steel. And then, of course, the main reason that we get the wooden fermenters is I like wild yeast and bacteria to live in that wood to affect the character of the whiskey as everything goes by. So it's cascading effect. The whiskey is better. You're using less in the way of chemicals and fewer. And the same thing with water and the same thing with labor. So it's having my brother around. We like to say it's a bit like having a howitzer when you need a fly swatter. Where you're thinking through every last part of the process, and do we really need to bring that thing in? do we need to, and try to be as efficient as we possibly can without sacrificing quality, because we're certainly not going to do that.
Bob, give me a sense of what you guys deal with up there in Whitehorse, because as I noted, basically you go north from Edmonton to Calgary, hang about a northwest turn and drive for about a day and a half, 2 days, and then you get towards Whitehorse. So you've got to have a lot of stuff hauled in as well. Give me a sense of how you guys try to make your processes as efficient as possible to make the most of what you do have to get brought in.
You're right. We're about 1,900 kilometers north and west of Edmonton, so a fair ways up here. Fortunately, a lot of the ingredients that we use are water, and we have plenty of that. It's interesting to hear of the water struggles that Todd was talking about. We're in flood right now. We have more snow this winter than you can ever imagine. And in fact, I was entered into a canoe race that was going to be at the end of June, where you can paddle all night long without lights because it doesn't get dark. And the race was canceled the day before it left because of dangers from high water. So we're at the absolute other end of the stick from where Todd was. So, but in terms of grain, as you probably know, we're a brewery before we're a distillery. We started brewing beer in the late 90s. We'll turn 25 next year, and it wasn't until 2009 that we bought our still. So we've been operating for about 12 years when we moved the still in. We still make whiskey only when we have time. We're beer focused, and when I say have time, that's all winter long. In the summer, we're so busy making beer that we don't make any spirits, or certainly not any whiskey in the summertime. So in about another month here, we'll start making whiskey again. We're starting to acquire our barrels and so on. Those are a lot of fun to be able to get because, of course, you can't stockpile barrels. They'll get moldy and unusable. So we have to bring in what we need. So we can't bring a container load of barrels in. We can only bring in what we need and go from there. But you're right, freight costs for us are, at the end of the day, they're just a way of life, and they're part of the cost of the final product. And it's part of the cost of living in the Yukon. And I know that Mark, having lived in Alaska, that there's reasons to live in the north, and it just becomes a trade.
The thing that's unusual about your whiskeys, Bob, is that most craft distillers focus on their home market as the place they start selling. You guys had to send all of your stuff pretty much outside of the Yukon at the beginning, right?
Well, we knew that at the beginning with beer, that if we had to rely on our local market, the Yukon has about 40,000 people in it. And that's probably what Todd can see out his window if he looks around.
The football stadium in Denver holds more than that.
Well, exactly. Looking out his window, let alone driving around in his car for a while. So we're a tiny market, and as noted, we're a couple thousand kilometers from anybody. So we knew we had to entice people from elsewhere to the products we made. And with beer, that's really tough because it's a very low value to weight ratio. Making spirits is real different. We can ship a pallet of whiskey somewhere. As a matter of fact, we just sent our first shipment off to France a couple months ago. We can afford to do that because of the value of the whiskey that's going there. So it's always been a challenge for us being far away. We're quite lucky being in the Yukon, and again, I know this is more of a WhiskyCast, but with our beer, our draft beer in the Yukon outsells those big Molson Labatt guys combined. So we have tremendous local support, which is probably a pretty key thing when you're in a market of 40,000 people.
I could live with that very easily. I'd rather drink local stuff and drink your stuff than Molson's or Labatt's or Budweiser or any of the mass-produced beers.
Well, it sure didn't start there in the late 90s. In fact, when we were going through our licensing process at the beginning, the head of licensing at the local liquor corporation stopped me in the hall on the way to a meeting and said, "Why are you even doing this? There's all kinds of beer out there." And my answer to her was, the number one selling pasta in the world is craft dinner. That doesn't necessarily mean that I want to eat craft dinner when I'm having pasta. So we're going to not make craft dinner. We're going to make something else.
Todd, I want
disrespect
you
to craft dinner, by the way.
Todd, you guys have, I think, perhaps I could be wrong about this, but the only distillery, or at least the oldest distillery in the States with a malting floor, right?
Let me think about that. I think Rick Wassman's place.
Yeah, he does. He does have a small one. Yeah.
Yeah, he may have.
I should know that because I've seen it.
Yeah, I believe he was the first. I know that Rogue, both brewing and spirits, they had a small malt house. I don't know how frequently they ran it, but Rick was, as far as I'm aware, was the first, I believe. I'm always cautious about these things because, first of all, we're getting older and forgetting, and there's just so many plants, and you don't want to leave somebody out unintentionally. But we've been malting for about 7 years now, and we're one of the few places. The one thing I can say is that we take care of all of our malting needs in house, and so, we're kind of in the opposite situation that you have in the Yukon. Coors is in our backyard. And for folks who don't know, Coors has been malting from the word go. And it's one of the largest malting operations on the planet. And as a result, we just have world-class farming here. It doesn't matter what grain I throw at them. It doesn't, the Abruzzi rye that we have grown for us. I wouldn't have done that in any other state, but it's the easiest thing in the world because the farmer, all the farmers look at me. Okay, well, what do you need? What are you looking for protein, nitrogen, all that kind of thing, moisture content. They can get it disease free, which is easy out here because it's such a dry climate. So basically, my job as a maltster here is to not screw up what the farmers did. It's kind of the long and the short of it, because it's just absolutely beautiful malting barley that it's my job to get the best flavors that I can get out of it, is kind of the long and short of it. But we would not have opened the malt house if it wasn't for Coors doing all of that heavy lifting, and they still do, of course.
We have a question for you, Bob, from Whiskey Canuck in Quebec, hoping two brewers can make another appearance in Quebec sometime soon. When might you be sending some stuff to the SAQ?
Good question. Thanks for that. We do sell whiskey in Quebec. We do have an agent there. As you're probably, or many people are aware of, the cumbersome provincial borders that exist in Canada that make it so hard. I saw a question pop up, or a comment about prices in Ontario at the LCBO, and dealing with all these guys is very tough. And you know what? It's great to be asked when it's available, because we make what we make when we're making whiskey to drink it, not to make money on it, not to retire on it. We do that with beer. So we can make what we want, and we can make the efforts to get it where people want it. So we did send some to Quebec probably about a year ago, and we wait for our agent there to be able to drum up more interest. But yeah, it's baby steps, that's for sure.
And Bill Ricker points out that from what he hears, the selection at the LCBO is even worse than the prices. Yeah, I've been to the LCBO, and neither one of them are really good. Todd, I want you to tell us about this still.
Okay.
Because, first of all, where did you find details on a 3-chamber still, and what exactly does this thing do?
Well, and this will turn off in a second, the phone. Sorry about that. I came across a paper that was written just after the Bottled and Bond Act. And what they were looking to do was take a look right after the Bottled and Bond Act passed. And this little chunk I got from Dave Wondrich, the wonderful historian. The IRS head at the time was a whiskey nerd. And they have documentation of, on his vacations, him going to Scotland and Ireland in the 1800s and distillery hopping to go visit the distilleries. Well, he took great offense at all the counterfeiting that was happening at the time in the United States that led to the Bottled and Bond Act. After the Bottled and Bond Act was passed, he commissioned 2 of his scientists to go and look at 31 different distilleries in America, all throughout the country. and when I say all throughout the country, it was the late 1800s. So basically, as far as Indiana or Illinois. But he looked at 31 different distilleries, and about half of them made rye. The other half made bourbon. And of the rye distillers, they broke down everything that had to do with the production process. Well, not everything, but things like what was the grist recipe? How many pounds? How big was the still? Was the warehouse heated? All of these little simple details. And every single one of the rye distillers, except for one, used what was called a chamber still, or a 3-chamber still was the bulk of them. And when I came across that paper about 15 years ago, like so many people, I asked, what the hell is a 3-chamber still? I had no idea what that was, what it meant, or more importantly, there it is, why this seemed to be the tool of choice for rye producers back in those days. And I came across a secondary paper that really kind of cinched it for me, and it was just a short essay, kind of a paper about what was at the time the largest distillery in the world. It was a Hiram Walker plant, so we kind of see the tie-in here with Canada. It was a Hiram Walker plant that was the largest distillery in the world at the time, and it was brand new. They had just commissioned it. I believe it was commissioned in 1910 or somewhere around there. I've forgotten all the numbers. Again, I'm getting old, I think. But they put in 2 columns and a 3-chamber still in a plant that was designed to make 100,000 gallons of whiskey per day. So that doesn't really make any sense to put in something as inefficient as a 3-chamber still, and I'll explain how it works in just a second, versus, as we talked off air, a column still. So a column still, you're basically, you got your column and you've got the mash that's entering the still at the top. And it's designed so that the mash cascades down essentially some internal stairs is an easy way to look at it. And then from the bottom, they inject live steam, which strips the alcohol out on the way to a condenser. The design from entry at 8 or 10% alcohol and exiting the bottom is animal feed. From entry to exit is 90 seconds. So you can understand why, if you're a large producer, and in the case of the Hiram Walker plant, you wanted to make 100,000 gallons a day, why wouldn't you just put 4 or 5 of those column stills in? Why would you put a 3-chamber still in? And the answer is it produces a whiskey that's so different that the average consumer can tell. And so that's why they put that still in. When I saw that paper, I recognized that was the case. Also, of course, I worked out from, you can see the drawing that you have there, understand how it's different. So as you can see, you've got mash in each one of the 3 chambers. So by the time you're done, picture that mash totals about 10 feet of rye mash. Most of the recipes were 80% rye, 20% malted barley. You'd make a 5 or 6% alcohol beer. You'd put mash in each one of the 3 chambers. Let's pretend that we've been running it for half the day. It's the easiest way to think of it, is that production has already been going. All 3 of those chambers are filled. You just finished collecting the heads, hearts, and tails of the last batch. And what you do is you turn the steam on. The steam bubbles up through the bottom chamber. And you can see the arrows. It goes through that center column and goes through those elbows. And the elbow that you see there, all that does is makes it so that the mash, as long as the mash is below those elbows, it won't fall into the bottom chamber, but it allows the gas from the chamber below to bubble through it. So you can kind of follow the arrows there. The steam starts in the bottom chamber, bubbles up through the chamber above it, bubbles up through the chamber above it on its way to a condenser. And as you're running that, when you turn that steam on, you'll get your head cut coming out of where it says alcohol tester in about 2 minutes. You'll start to get your head cut, and just like you would for any pot still, you've got your head, heart, and tail cut. You're checking for clarity. Once it runs clear on the first, you're moving away from the head cut into your hearts. That's what's going to go into your output to spirit safe. That's what's going to go down into your whiskey barrels. And then, just like as with a pot still, when the proof starts to drop, the flavors get a little unrefined. You start collecting you start moving into your tail cut, basically. So from your head to your heart to your tails cut for this one single run, it's about 30 minutes. So once you're done collecting that head, heart, and tail cuts, you shut the steam off. Then you take the very bottom chamber. That goes off to stillage. If you saw that little arrow, that goes off to animal feed. And then you take the mash that's above it. You see the valve on the left-hand side where it says valve to empty middle chamber. You move that chamber down, you move the chamber above it, and where it says beer feed input, you top it up again, and you start the whole process over again. So it's a batching system, which is much less efficient than a column still. But more importantly, instead of getting just 90 seconds of steam treatment, each one of those mashes, by the time it's moved into all three chambers, it's got 90 minutes of steam treatment at much, much higher temperatures because, as I mentioned at the start, there's 10 feet ahead, 10, 12, 15 feet ahead, depending on the design of the still. And that raises the temperature in that bottom chamber. And what that does is it extracts a lot more things that are soluble in water. And what that means are oils. So the way I like to describe it is it's an oil extraction machine. So what that does is it makes it, at the time they would market it as heavy-bodied whiskey. And it's unbelievably oily and unctuous. And that, of course, holds all the flavors onto your palate. It makes it so the finish lasts for days. But more importantly, in my mind, it's pulling out beautiful notes that you won't get into the distillate using a pot or a column. And so it's just a very, very different type of still. And it was also commonly used both in Canada and the US for blending. So you can kind of think everybody understands, or if you're into whiskey, you understand Whistle Pig basically is the flavoring rye that's blended off with grain or grain whiskey with the higher proof grain whiskey off of a column to make all the various Canadian clubs and all the different kinds of whiskeys like that. The three chamber was used in this same manner. So it wasn't just sold on its own, which is very popular in Baltimore and Pennsylvania. It was also blended off with that column whiskey to make it heavier or lighter, depending on the label, basically. But that's kind of the long and the short of the three chamber still, without keeping your poor fans here for days.
Bob, I know you were asking beforehand about where this originally came from before we started the show. What was your question back then? Do you remember offhand?
I'm trying to remember. I was curious when Todd was talking about doing research from so long ago and finding how common this was. It's new to me, so I'm making some notes here. Somebody actually put a comment on that you guys have a great video. I assume it's about that still, so I want to learn more about it. And actually, what went through my mind is, when's that damn border going to open so I can come and see it?
Well, believe me, I'd like to, as you can tell, I'm a bit of a Canada fan. I'm a big fan of Toronto. I'm still feel bad about taking the Nordiques to Denver. Sorry about that. But when we were in Ann Arbor, Michigan for about 10 years, we looked into the LCBOs because we were right down the road from Toronto. And it's punitive for small producers. So basically, you sell it at this very what's the word I'm looking for? Aggressive markup. And if it doesn't sell, you have to pay either to destroy it or to bring it back. And it's the Canadian system, in my opinion. Now, I haven't looked at it in a while, but it's designed for selling an awful lot of stuff. And if you can't sell a ton of it, they're not sure what to do with it. So for small producers or hard to find bottles, it makes it really difficult to get on the shelves. And I think all of us small producers, and I can imagine up in Canada, if you're a small distiller, you're waiting for the LCBO to change their system up somehow so that it helps the smaller producers. And in particular, I'd like to see them help the Canadian distillers personally. But it's just really not designed for that, unfortunately, because believe me, I'd like nothing more than to go back and catch a couple hockey games and sell some of our whiskey up there.
Well,
we do have a question for you. Go ahead, Bob.
No, I was just going to say that it's interesting when you talk about the Canadian system, and there are a couple places where it's not quite what you describe as bang on. It's very punitive for small guys. We talked to the LCBO, and they said, well, we'll consider your whiskey. Can you send us a sample of what you'll have available, say, 6 months from now? And I said, no, because we do it in small batches. We don't know what will be out 6 months from now. And that just freaks them out. They don't know what to do with that. So Alberta, the Yukon, a couple places are not so bad. But part of the reason that we just sold some whiskey to France is that it was way easier to sell in France than it is in another province. So,
yeah,
that's a pretty good example.
Well, if it means anything, we deal with the same thing with a lot of the state-run liquor stores down here in the States, where it just doesn't compute. These are antiquated systems that are designed for having 3 or 4 large distilleries that just control everything, and the market needs to be remade a little bit, or I should say, I think you and I would appreciate it very much if they would look to tweak these systems a little bit to give the small distillers a chance. But you're absolutely right. Selling to the EU and the UK. The UK was our biggest customer for a good solid 10 years. Their taxation and VAT system was very simple and understandable. You could get a human on the line. It was pretty miraculous for an American anyway, to see something like that. And we did delightful business for a good solid decade, because there weren't any gin distilleries in London. Our gin did very, very well there. And of course now there are over 70 gin distillers, and sadly nobody cares about Leopold's anymore now that they can get wonderful local London gin, and who could blame them? But anyway.
We had this question from Christopher Malloy, and you mentioned Lomond and column stills. The difference between this 3-chamber still and the Lomond or the column still is that you've got the wash coming down as the steam comes up through the plates, and it's not you're not separating the chambers. It doesn't have separate chambers the way your still does.
Correct.
Basically, it's one continuous process as it comes down, while yours, you can move it back and forth between chambers.
Yeah, it's just a much longer, slower process. I've tried to use some simple analogies, like it's the difference between slow barbecue pit cooking versus throwing a couple burgers on the grill. But not only does that not make any scientific sense, it kind of falls on its face. But the easy thing to understand is, from a scientific and practical perspective, elevated temperatures and longer heat treatment. And those two things are altering what's being pulled out of that mash. That's the easiest way to explain it.
We have a question again from Whiskey Canuck. And while this is addressed to Todd, I'm going to address it to both of you, because you both have unusual backstories with this 3-chamber still, Todd, that you have, and with your stories up in Whitehorse, Bob. Have you had trouble getting attention from the wholesalers or the agents and the customers, because these whiskeys aren't usual compared to, for lack of a better term, the commodity whiskeys that are all over the place that everybody knows about?
Please.
Well, certainly true for us. Sorry, Todd. And I think it's given our geography, I can't go and sit down in front of somebody and explain what it is we're doing. And we've had the experience over and over again, and maybe Todd has had the same thing, where until somebody actually tries a sample of our whiskey and stops in their tracks, they just think, it's another Canadian whiskey, or it's a craft distiller wannabe who wishes they could do things as well as those characters in Scotland. And when they get some in their mouth, they, like I say, I've had that experience where they stop and they go, "Are you kidding me? Did you put something else in this bottle? This is what you're making?" And it's a great experience, but it's really hard to make that happen when we're just toiling away off in the corner making, and for us, Todd, we make 5 or 6 batches a year. That's it. We don't, like I say, it's for us, honestly, it's a science project that we love to be able to do. We wish we had more time to do. But on the other hand, we're glad we don't have time to do it, because that beer pays the bills pretty well.
Well, I come from the very same perspective. I was a brewer for 15 years, went to Siebel Institute and then Doman's over in Germany. So the analogy I like to make, it's the same. You're dealing with the same stone throwing that the brewers had to go through. In the 90s, why doesn't Sierra Nevada Pale Ale or Big Rock, or pick, your brewery? Why doesn't it taste like Bass Ale? Or back then, the idea that an American or a Canadian brewer could make a world-class Pilsner or Belgian-style beer was kind of laughable. And now, of course, after 2-3 decades of work, now it's the other way around. Now your customers are saying, "Why the hell would I drink something else when I can get world-class beer that's made right down the road. I know the brewer. The same thing's happening with whiskey. So we've been distilling now for a little over 20 years, I guess, around 20 years. And we had to deal with the same thing. So when we were distilling in Ann Arbor, I routinely got to ask, you make the gin in the back. You mean like a bathtub? Or me explaining that I'd been to, I'd studied fermentation in Germany. I'm not just, some guy with a couple plastic buckets in back. So it's just going to take time. And of course, what's happening now is it's not so much I guess in the industry, what you call a gatekeeper. So in other words, somebody that's running a bar, or somebody that's running, the spirits program there, or somebody that's doing the purchasing at a liquor store, they're no longer the issue, at least not here in America. They know who we are. They're very, very supportive of what we do. It's a question of getting it to the consumer so that they get it and they understand it. And that just takes time. There's no easy shortcut. You just go one bottle at a time. And, over time, they'll start to realize that, there are other whiskeys out there, other than, Buffalo Trace or Lot 40, which are, these are beautiful whiskeys. I'm not saying they're not, but there are other choices that are out there, and the consumers will come around. It just takes time. That's my experience.
Bob, one of the things I found with your whiskeys, with that wow factor, tasting it for the first time, was the fact that because beer pays the bills for you guys, you were able to wait 7 years before you put the first one into a bottle.
Great.
And that's what stuns folks.
Well, when we built the still, it arrived in a couple of crates from Germany, and we put it together on Easter weekend, actually, in 2009. And we thought, well, that's no problem. We can afford to wait until 2012 to sell it, because, of course, in Canada, it needs to be in the barrel for 3 years to be able to call it whiskey. And in 2012, we tasted it, and we thought, it's getting there, but it's another year would do it so well. And we had that exact same verbatim conversation in 2014 and 2015 and 2016, when we finally thought, this finish line keeps moving. Eventually, we have to sell some of this stuff. So yeah, you're right. It was 7 years before we got it out. Of course, some of our 2009 liquid is still in barrels, so it's getting to be pretty good. Although I really hesitate. I hate to go there, because age is only one of the many things that contribute or is a factor in making whiskey that's particularly good. We're very conscious of the barrels in our barrel program, and we will move things around barrels, because in the big picture, we've got about 400 barrels. It's tiny that we put together over all this time, so we can move things around. We can put things in virgin oak for a while, then move them to ex-bourbon, or we can move them to a sherry barrel or a rum barrel, or whatever we'd like to do. We have the time to be able to do that. The other thing that we do, of course, is because we're brewers first, all of our beer, all of our fermentations are made with brewers' grains. So we'll use roasted barley and chocolate malt and honey malt and Munich malt and you name it. So all of the new make we make, very little of it is made just with pale barley. The way we describe it is that we're trying to create many, many shades of colors, so that when we go to put our painting together later, it's not just the primary colors that we're using. We have all kinds of nuances that we can build expressions with. So yes, we had the advantage of time. We still have the advantage of time. We have the advantage of time in that we don't chase customers. We know that if we don't find customers, we'll just drink it. It's all good.
You're making me very much want to hop off this call and come visit, by the way.
The door's open, Todd.
Yeah, the border is open now going north. It's not open coming south, as some folks have pointed out. Our pal Tyrone Cote is asking from Nova Scotia for you to describe the two brewers' core flavor profile. And let me expand on that and get you to describe the three profiles, because you break it really into your classic, your peated, and then your specialty production, right?
Yeah, we actually have four categories we use. Classic, like a classic Scotch style whiskey, peated, which is self-evident. special finish when we use something like a sherry or a port or a rum barrel, something like that to finish it. We did one in maple syrup barrels where we're actually wood aging the maple syrup. The fellow we worked with would take the maple syrup out, we'd fill it back with whiskey, we go back and forth, and before we put that whiskey on the market, we went back and forth 5 times over a couple of years. So slowly but surely, we pulled that maple flavor out of the barrel while he was pulling the whiskey into his maple syrup. And then the fourth one we have is actually called Innovative. And that was because we thought, if it doesn't fit into one of those first 3 categories, what are we going to do? And in a way, that was not the smartest move we ever made, because when you call a category innovative, you best innovate. And excuse me, in a way that's been tough, in a way it's been great, because it forces us to constantly be putting our thinking caps on, trying to think, well, what can we do that we've never heard anyone do before? So all of the whiskeys that we do are, we're up to release 27 now. Each one is small and numbered and consecutive and falls into one of those categories. So we definitely have a flavor. We've heard it many times that people can tell our whiskey because there's a character to them, but every release is completely different from the one before. So yes, we do, and no, we don't.
We're getting some comments about home brewing and then freeze distillation. And you guys do something, well, I guess it's almost like freeze maturation way up in north in the Yukon, because it gets pretty damn cold in the middle of the winters in Whitehorse, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but all of our barrels are stored indoors, so they all see a pretty constant temperature year-round, around 15 degrees Celsius year-round. But one thing that does change a lot in the winter is humidity levels. If it's 30 or 40 below outside, there is no moisture in the air whatsoever. It has no ability to hold it. And yet the barrels are stored inside the brewery. So when we're busy making beer, the humidity goes up. And then when we're not, and over the weekends, the humidity goes down. So there's a very variable humidity regime that these barrels see over the course of a year and over the course of the winter.
And we had a question from Tabitha earlier that she was wanting to know if you guys do the traditional Canadian thing with splitting up the grains before distillation, after distilling, and then before during maturing them, and then blending them after maturation. You guys are doing single malt exclusively, so that doesn't apply here. Let's just get that out of the way, right?
That's correct. 100% of the whiskey we do, most of it's malted barley, regardless of the type of barley it is. But if we're using wheat or if we're using rye, which we've done, it's always malted first.
Now, Todd, tell us what else you guys make besides the 3-chamber rye, which is really just starting to hit the market, right?
Yeah, that's our 4.5-year-old bottled and bond effort. We make bottled and bond bourbon. We've kind of done a lot of firsts down here in America. We made the first American Fairnet, first American Maraschino, first American Amaro. We did the first revival of the Maryland Rye style of whiskey several years ago. At the time I put that together, there weren't any distilleries making, or at least that I'm aware of, that were making whiskey in Maryland at the time. And I thought, what a pity to let that fun style go away. We make vodka, 3 different kinds of gin, absinthe. We make a little bit of everything. And the reason we got into that is it was a necessity as a mother of invention. As I mentioned, our bar was next to the big house. It was about 2.5 blocks away. Big place. We could hold about 300 people, big, long picnic tables, to get people to sit and drink together and have fun. But in 1999, it was we had a manufacturing license, which means we could only sell what we made. And what I made was wildly popular, he says with sarcasm, unfiltered lagers, because that's what I really fell in love with working over in Franconia and Bavaria. Unfiltered Pilsner, what's called country beer or Keller beer, I guess these days. And back in 1999, there just weren't enough beer fans at the time. And so what happened was people would either start their night at our place and then go for cocktails uptown, or end their night at our place, which is, as you can imagine, a horrible, horrible business plan. And so the only way to get out of it was to add distillation. And I still had wonderful contacts over in Austria and Germany from brewing school. And so I went and made eau de vie for a few months over there. Kirschwasser, fruit brandy, unaged fruit brandy. Kirschwasser is probably the most famous one out of the Black Forest region, which is one of the distilleries I worked at was in the Black Forest region. And we came back and we pulled a distilling license, a winemaking license, and I was basically populating a cocktail bar. So we made the vodka, the gin, the sweet vermouth, the dry vermouth. I was dumb enough to think that we needed vermouth back in 2001. We didn't. Orange liqueur, blackberry liqueur, essentially what you would need to make drinks. So we were really one of the first distillery pubs in the country, if not the first, or I don't really know. But it was, understand that this was unusual back in 2001. Making all these different things nobody did that. Everybody either made, gin or bourbon or that was it. And so we were a very odd duck, I guess. And it just kind of spilled over from there. And we have fans who love our liqueurs who have no clue that we make gin. If you think about an American liquor store, there's a gin section, there's a whiskey section, right? As opposed to beer, it's all in one place. But if you like whiskey, you're never going to see who's making what in the gin section or the vodka section, right? So it's a very segmented marketplace, which is kind of fun. Again, we're coming up on our 22nd year, and we still have people who come and visit who say, "I had no idea you made a bourbon." It's pretty crazy.
But at least you've graduated from all that other stuff like vermouth and vodka and stuff to good brown spirits that take time to age and mature.
Hey, listen, I always tell Charles Cowdery, the American historian, he's such a wonderful curmudgeon that you can't make gin without vodka. And I'm a gin fan, but we didn't source whiskey, and the vodka, the gin, the rest of the things. Again, this was 2001. We couldn't get a wholesaler to return our phone calls if we didn't have a vodka to sell. The market was totally different. There's no such thing as a whiskey fan. That didn't really exist. There were splashes of it back in the Michael Jackson era of whiskey. Teeny amounts of people who enjoyed Scotch and had no idea there was Irish whiskey. And, I'm sure Canadian whiskey confused the hell out of them too. And nobody understood the difference between bourbon and rye. The market has changed completely. And it goes back to, the logistics and the laws. In Michigan, we could not sell our whiskey on site. That was illegal. If we could have done it, you would be hearing the exact same story where we would be making beer all the time and whiskey whenever the hell we felt like it. Except for the difference for us is we'd be making beer for the football season and we'd be making all the whiskey during the summer when the students are gone. But it was illegal. So there wasn't much of a financial incentive at the time to put, it's expensive, obviously, to put those barrels of whiskey down, all that labor, all those raw materials. Barrels aren't cheap. I don't want to see what your shipping bills look like to do that. But it's very, very expensive and difficult to do and stay independent. That's the part that I think so many people miss, that, we have several thousand barrels down, and doing that at a cash flow and telling Brown Forman and other companies, no, thank you, we're not for sale, is harder than you'd think. So.
How often do you get calls from the big boys asking you if you're up for sale?
Oh, that kind of passed. We had a wave of that about maybe 5 years ago, and we're very, very polite and don't want to waste anybody's time to have them go through the machinations of the sliding the piece of paper across the table thing, right? So we never got to the point where I could say that somebody got to wanted to actually buy us. So. They could have just been coming out to kick the tires for all I know. I don't have an answer, I guess.
You mentioned regulations. Question from Graham Fraser in England. Given the bottled in bond rules and regulations, is it more expensive to make that style? I would think it has to be.
Well, it would have been back in the days where you would have, and if you go to Woodford Reserve, they have a really wonderful tour, and they have an actual house where the government man actually lived on site and did the nuclear, launch code thing where two keys to open up the warehouse together with the master distiller every morning. But we don't have to deal with that. It's the same paperwork that you have to deal with for everything else. We have to account for every pound of grain that comes in, when you're purchasing it, what goes where, what goes in the barrels where. It's the same completely ridiculous, silly paperwork. It doesn't matter if it's 10 years old, 2 years old, or bottled in bond. The reason we like bottled in bond is it lets people know that we made every drop of this. And that's kind of a nice, simple thing for consumers and people that are fans of whiskeys in general to understand, oh, okay, bottles in bond means a little something different when we're talking about an American producer. So we're fans of it, but there isn't any additional onerous paperwork or anything like that.
Bob, give us an idea of the paperwork, the regulations you have to deal with up north, except for the 3 years rule.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. We're actually listening to Todd talk reminded me of when we wanted to start our distilling portion of our operation. We learned very quickly that our Territorial Liquor Act did not permit distilling. Ooh. And it had words in it about wine making and beer and so on, but nothing about spirits. So in typical fashion, we went in to talk to our minister. And when you live in the Yukon, if you can't find your minister, just wait in the grocery store. You'll run across him on Saturday. And he said, that we have to change that. He said, the problem is that the House is in session and you can only introduce changes to legislation in the first week of a session. So we're too late for this one, but it'll be in the next one. And we thought, yeah, we've heard that kind of thing before. It's like the checks in the mail. And so we thought, well, we're going to carry on with our project. We'll do our research. We had to build an addition onto the building to be able to house the operation. Let's carry on with that. Let's pretend this is all going to happen. We'll see what happens. And sure as heck, the session finished and the next one opened. And the very first act change that was proposed was to be able to permit distilling in the Liquor Act. Everything that we want to do, it makes me smile when Todd talks about what he was permitted to do in Michigan. And I grew up in Windsor, by the way, Todd. I know the very well. So I was an hour away where I grew up on my side of the border.
That's great.
But nonetheless, every time we go in and we talk to them, they say, well, what is it you want to do? And we tell them, they say, well, okay, let's make that change. They're so eager to accommodate somebody who's doing something, what they consider to be very novel, whether it's making beer or making spirits. I mean, we're such a corner of the world that, or certainly a corner of the country that relies so heavily on government funding and government jobs. And I think 2/3 of the people who live here work for one level of government or another. It's that kind of a crazy place. And that's great for us because they all get paid well and they can afford to buy our product. But the fact that somebody wants to do something privately, they trip over themselves to help us out. So real fortunate on our part that way.
That's great to hear.
Well, as somebody who worked in Detroit radio for about a year, I used to go over back in the 80s. I used to go to Windsor all the time for dinner and drinks and stuff, and loved it over there. So yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. But that was where I got my first experience with the LCBO too. So, question from Christopher Malloy for you, Todd. He wants to know if you're familiar with the casks coming out of Adirondack Cooperage in New York, and do you have any thoughts?
I'm sorry, I have no thoughts on that. I've never used them. We are 100%, well, not 100. For the new char American oak, we are 100% out of Independent Stave, which is a larger outfit. It's Missouri oak, and they just do a wonderful job. And they've been with us for an awful long time and stuck with us when they could have kicked us to the curb. There was a barrel shortage, I guess about 6 years ago where it hit, where they could have, where they were shorting their larger customers. who wanted to expand to take care of our piddly little place. And we're a very, very loyal company. And when you find business partners that actually stand behind their word, we hold on to them like grim death. So we haven't used anybody else's cooperage. So I'm sorry, I don't have an opinion one way or the other. Can't share that with you.
Not a problem. Bob, any chance at all that we might one day be able to get your whiskeys south of the 49th parallel?
I don't see any reason why not. And maybe it's just my bad business sense, where I would rather sit on my deck and have a beer than I would go hunting distributors to carry our products in places that I don't really understand. The reason that we are selling whiskey in France was that we made a connection with a guy who lives in Vancouver, and we were able to get on the same wavelength very quickly. My guess is that sometime in the States, we will find the same distributor who understands that he's not going to buy train carloads of whiskey, and that's not his vision. And it comes down to someone with the same vision that we have. We're very, very focused on the liquid in the bottle. Couldn't give a rat's butt about the volume that we sell. We would rather have it in the hands of people who love it than in more people.
I'm falling in love with your whiskey, if you don't mind me saying at all. We have very much the same approach, except for we don't have a brewery anymore to help keep the lights on and to, let less is more, and not chase volume for volume's sake. That's what I'm hearing, and that's a conversation my brother and I have all the time, where what are we doing this for? What's the point behind all of this? And we have no interest in getting into a rat race. And so it's myself and 3 other folks in production, and we're doing one last little small expansion, just simply because we need a bit more room for our barrels. Sell what we can to the folks who appreciate it, and keep it as simple as that. And believe me, when you retire, you're going to be awful happy that you held on to that, what I can only imagine is beautiful whiskey. You're going to be happy that you have a few cases of that set aside for yourself.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because often somebody will talk to me about one of the previous releases that we've done, because like I say, they're all consecutive. And my comment was, I never did get a bottle of that one. I can tell you about it because while we were developing the flavors and we were testing different ABVs and different expressions that were put together before we settled on one, I have some notes from that, but doggone it, I'm not smart enough to make sure I get a bottle of that before it sells out. So there are some I wish I had now.
But Bob, I want you to tell us about your latest release that you were bottling this week, because it actually goes back to some of those first casks, right?
I would have to actually look at and see what the mix was, but yes, definitely some of them do go back to the first cask. We've never put an age statement on our whiskey for the simple reason that we don't want to be limited by what we're putting together as the expression of that particular liquid. If we think that some 4 or 5 year old is bringing the character that we're looking for, we don't want to not use it because it's too young. We want to exactly use it because it tastes perfect in that mix. So I would have to go back to the sheets, quite honestly, to be able to answer that question without making stuff up, which I don't want to do.
Well, I just saw it on your website today that it was 11-year-old stuff from back when you guys, from the early stuff that you had, that was in batch 27, I think.
Well, I should have asked you that question then, because you know that and I didn't know that. So there you go.
It's fun when you don't have to pay attention to this stuff and you get to worry about the beer all the time and do the whiskey for fun. I think what you guys have got going on up there is just absolutely a hoot. And I keep saying this, I have got to get back up to Whitehorse and see you guys at some point.
Yeah, it'd be great to see you back up here. And I'm not sure if Todd's familiar, but Mark and I meet, or we're meeting once a year in Victoria, at the Victoria Whiskey Fest in Vancouver Island in January, which is a fantastic. When you're in the Yukon in January, and you can go to Victoria and it's above freezing and it's 30 below where you left, you're pretty much going there come hell or high water. But the only thing that could get in the way of me going there is a global pandemic. So there we go.
Yep. The only thing I know about Victoria is that's where the Gate brothers are from, the lacrosse players. I have not had the pleasure of being up there, but I got to tell you, I'm going to be getting off of this call, looking at the map a little bit more, with a bit more seriousness, and see if my wife and 6-year-old daughter want to have an adventure. Because I love the story that you're telling, and I can only imagine how good your beer is, let alone your whiskey.
I just find it astonishing that we can all get together on this call. And at one point in time, we were all about 60 miles apart between Ann Arbor, Detroit, and Windsor.
That's right.
That's astonishing.
Yep. Well, guys, thank you for joining us tonight. Bob Baxter from Yukon Spirits and Two Brewers Whiskey, Todd Leopold from Leopold Brothers Distilling in Denver. Thank you, guys, and you both make great whiskeys, and I can't wait to try the 3-chamber rye yet. Todd, I've not had the chance to try that yet. I really want to try it.
Well, it sounds like I need to put together 2 bottles here, right?
But I know I've had Bob's whiskeys before. And Todd, yes, I would be glad to try some of that. I'd love to post tasting notes for that. And thanks for joining us, guys. And before we go, I want to just mute you guys for just a second here so that we can give you a tip of what's coming up this weekend on the show. You have probably seen and heard about the Netflix documentary Heist, and Pappygate is featured this time around, the infamous thefts of Pappy Van Winkle whiskies. And I want to give you just a quick preview.
But what we done, man? I mean, what was it? It's like stealing a piece of bubble gum from the supermarket.
Think about it. If you worked at Buffalo Trace right now and you had an opportunity to stick 2 20-year-old Van Winkles down your pants, walk out with nobody seeing you, are you going to do it if you don't get caught?
That was the one and only Gilbert Toby Kurtzinger, the guy who masterminded, allegedly, the Pappygate thefts years ago. And I talked the other day with Nick Frew, the director of Heist. Here's just a bit of why he was able to get Toby Kurtzinger to tell his story.
If you watch all of the stories, there's an emphasis on getting inside the heads of these people, because we sold the show to Netflix and with the hook of like, this is something that everybody has thought of. Everybody's sort of weighed up in their mind. Am I the sort of person that could do this? What would be the thing where I could take that extra step, cross that line? And I think the understanding that these people who have all basically made terrible mistakes, made a very questionable set of decisions, all got there from a place of they all had their own journey towards that any of us could have found ourselves on. And I think that when people understand that you're coming in going, I really want to just hear what it is that drove you to do this, and when they realize that you are listening, I think they find it quite comforting, and they're like, oh, this is actually a chance to have my voice heard, maybe set my record straight, find a bit of catharsis. You're dealing with people who are describing the most traumatic incidents of their lives in large part.
That is part of my interview with Nick Frew, the director of Heist, and we will have the entire interview on this weekend's WhiskyCast. Check it out this weekend and starting Monday morning at basically wherever you get your podcasts. That's all for this edition of the Happy Hour Webcast. We'll see you next Friday night. Take care of yourselves, be good to each other, and sláinte. Good night, everyone.